I want to be clear about what this is before anything else settles into your mind. This is not a story that begins with shadows moving on their own or voices where none should be. There are no warnings, no instincts screaming to leave, no moment where someone should have known better. This is about an ordinary night, the kind of night that happens thousands of times without consequence, the kind people forget as soon as it ends. The shift started the same way it always did. The clock behind the counter glowed a dull red, counting minutes that moved slowly but reliably. Outside, the road stretched in both directions, empty enough that headlights felt like events when they appeared. The gas station sat alone, lit from above by fluorescent panels that never fully stopped buzzing. They cast a flat, even light over the pumps, the asphalt, and the glass doors. Nothing was hidden. Nothing needed to be. Inside, the routine held everything together. Receipts printed and tore cleanly. The register drawer opened and closed with the same hollow sound. Shelves were straightened, drinks restocked, trash taken out and replaced. Coffee brewed, not because anyone wanted it at that hour, but because it was part of the checklist. These were motions learned by repetition, done without thought. Nights like this depended on consistency. The same cars usually passed at the same times, delivery trucks in the early hours, a lone driver stopping for fuel, eyes forward, conversations short. Most of the time, there was no one at all. Just the station and the road and the faint hum of electricity keeping everything awake. Silence was normal here. Not the kind that presses in or demands attention, just the absence of interruption. No voices drifting in from outside, no footsteps on the concrete, no music beyond whatever played low behind the counter. The doors stayed closed. The parking lot stayed empty. Time moved forward without resistance. Being alone was part of the job. The building was designed for it. Glass walls, clear sight lines, bright lights, everything visible, everything accounted for. It felt controlled, safe, in the way familiarity convinces you that nothing can change without warning. Looking back, there was nothing to point to. No sound out of place. No shape lingering too long in the dark. No reason to pause or feel concerned. If you had asked anyone working that shift how the night was going, the answer would have been simple, quiet, normal, almost over. By that point in the night, the body starts making quiet negotiations with itself. The worker on shift was young, old enough to be trusted alone, young enough to still be counting months instead of years. The kind of person who learned quickly, followed rules carefully, and believed that doing things the right way mattered. Tuition was expensive. Hours were available. That was the math that put them behind the counter while most of the world slept. Fatigue settled in gradually. Not the heavy kind that knocks you down, but the dull kind that smooths everything out. Movements slowed just enough to feel efficient. Thoughts narrowed to the next task. Wipe the counter. Check the cooler temperature. Glance at the clock. Repeat. The body stayed upright, but the mind drifted closer to autopilot. Being alone never felt dramatic. It was expected. The station had cameras, some bright lights, a direct line to the police, a panic button under the counter that had never been pressed. These details were mentioned during training, pointed out with confidence, as if their presence alone prevented anything from happening. Safety lived in those assumptions. The glass walls were supposed to mean visibility. The empty lot was supposed to mean peace. The late hour was supposed to keep trouble away. Every part of the environment had been explained, labeled, accounted for. There was no reason to question it. No reason to imagine anything beyond boredom and routine. Outside, the road stayed quiet longer than usual. No cars passed for a stretch that felt longer than it should have been. The worker noticed it without really thinking about it, the way you notice the air conditioning turning off or a song ending mid-chorus. It registered, then slipped away. Inside, the station felt larger when empty. Sounds carried farther. The hum of the freezers echoed slightly. Footsteps sounded louder than they should have on the tile floor. The worker moved between aisles, restocking drinks, counting bottles, keeping busy to stay awake. At one point, there was a pause. Nothing happened during it. No doors opened. No footsteps approached. Just a moment where the worker stopped moving and stood still, listening without knowing why. The silence held steady. The lights didn't flicker. The doors didn't open. After a few seconds, the moment passed. It was easy to dismiss. Long shifts do that. The mind invents patterns. The body looks for stimulation. The worker shook it off and went back to the task list, and unaware that this was the last moment the night would feel fully under control. There was still no threat, nothing to point to. Just the quiet sense that the station felt slightly more empty than it had before. The sound came first, but it was easy to miss. Not a door opening, not footsteps crossing the lot, just the soft, out-of-place noise of something shifting where nothing should have been moving. The worker only noticed because it interrupted the rhythm of the station, like a skipped beat in a song that had been playing all night. They looked up. The glass doors were still closed. The parking lot was still empty. The road beyond it remained dark and still. For a moment there was nothing to explain the sound, and that alone was enough to make the worker stand straighter, attention sharpening without panic. And then the presence registered. Someone was inside, not entering, not approaching, already there. The person stood a few feet away, close enough that the worker couldn't remember hearing the doors open at all. No chime, no movement in the corner of their vision. Just a man positioned near the counter, hands loose at his sides, posture relaxed as if he had been standing there for minutes. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. His face carried no urgency, no tension. He looked around the store slowly, eyes moving across shelves and signs with mild interest, like someone waiting for time to pass. The worker greeted him automatically. The words came out the same way they always did, practiced and polite. The man didn't respond right away. He kept looking, head tilting slightly as his gaze drifted toward the back of the store, and then back to the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, calm, almost conversational. He asked a simple question. Something ordinary, something that didn't require concern. His tone suggested he wasn't in a hurry, suggested he had nowhere else to be. Up close, there was nothing obvious to react to, no raised voice, no aggressive stance. He wasn't invading the counter space, he wasn't touching anything. He stood at a comfortable distance, close enough to be present, far enough to appear respectful. And yet, the worker felt it immediately. Not fear, not alarm. Just the sense that this interaction didn't follow the usual shape. The man didn't glance at the register, didn't scan for cameras, didn't fidget or rush his words. He spoke the way people do when they already know how something is going to end. As he talked, and his eyes drifted briefly toward the back hallway, then returned to the worker's face. The movement was subtle, easy to miss, but it lingered in the worker's mind longer than it should have. The worker answered his question. The man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The station remained quiet. The lights stayed steady. Outside, The road was still empty. Nothing had changed, and yet the worker was suddenly aware of how close the man stood, how small the space behind the counter felt, how alone the building truly was. The man shifted his weight slightly and let out a breath that sounded almost tired. That was when the worker realized the night had crossed into something unfamiliar, even though nothing had happened yet. The change was immediate. There was no raised voice, no warning, no step forward that allowed time to react. One moment the man stood still, weight settled evenly on both feet, and the next he moved with sudden purpose, closing the distance so fast the worker didn't understand what was happening until the counter edge struck hard against their ribs. The impact knocked the air out of them. A sharp, hollow sound escaped their throat before they could stop it. The man's hand came up, not wild, not frantic, but controlled, striking with force that felt deliberate rather than angry. The blow landed high, snapping the worker's head to the side, sending a bright flash across their vision. Objects fell. A display rattled. Something plastic skidded across the floor. There were no words. The worker reacted without thinking. Hands came up, not to fight, but to shield. A feet scrambled for balance on the slick tile. The world narrowed to sound and sensation. The thud of shoes against the floor, the dull crack of something hard meeting bone, the sharp buzz of the lights overhead suddenly unbearable. The man didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't demand anything. He struck again, harder this time, driving the worker backward until they collided with the cooler door behind them. The metal rang out, a flat, echoing noise that filled the empty store. Cold air spilled around them as the door popped open, the smell of refrigerated drinks mixing with the metallic taste rising in their mouth. Instinct took over. The worker kicked, not aiming, just trying to create space. Fingernails scraped against fabric. An elbow connected with something solid, sending a jolt of pain up their arm. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to stay upright, trying to stay conscious, trying to breathe. The man didn't react to the resistance the way someone angry would. He didn't escalate with shouting or panic. He adjusted, shifted his stance, applied more force, like correcting a mistake. The sounds were wrong for how quiet the night had been moments before. Heavy breaths, shoes squealing faintly against tile, the low, hollow thump of bodies colliding with fixtures meant to stay still. At some point, the worker realized they were on the floor. The ceiling lights blurred overhead as they tried to focus. The man loomed above them, movements efficient, unhurried. He grabbed and pulled, dragging them a short distance across the tile. Their shoulders struck the base of the counter. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but there was no time to register it fully. And still, no words. The worker reached out blindly and caught the edge of the counter with one hand, holding on with a grip that felt stronger than it should have been. The man pulled again, harder, and the skin of their fingers burned as they lost their hold. Somewhere in the chaos, the register drawer slid open with its familiar sound, absurdly ordinary in the middle of everything else. Bills shifted, coins rattled. The noise cut through the confusion like a reminder of what this place was supposed to be for. The man leaned over the open drawer briefly, scooping what was inside with quick, practiced movements. It took seconds, less time than it took the worker to draw a full breath. Then he stepped back. The violence stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The worker lay on the floor, chest heaving, ears ringing, while trying to understand what had just happened. Their bodies shook with leftover motion, muscles still braced for impact that didn't come. The man looked down at them once, expression unchanged. He didn't linger. He didn't check. He turned and walked toward the exit at the same calm pace he'd had when he first appeared. The door opened. The bell rang softly. Then the station was quiet again, except for the workers' breathing and the distant hum of the lights, carrying on as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The first sound of help did not feel comforting. Sirens approached from a distance, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt detached from what had just happened inside the station. By the time the doors opened again, the violence already felt unreal, like something that had occurred in a different location and to a different person. The worker was still on the floor when they arrived. Someone spoke first, then someone else. Voices layered over each other, calm and practiced. Instructions were given in short sentences. Hands hovered, then pressed gently at the shoulders and arms, checking for responses. A flashlight beam moved across their face, pausing briefly at the eyes before shifting away. Questions came, but they were asked the way questions are asked when the answers are already expected. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Did you lose consciousness? The worker answered when they could, nodding more than speaking. Their mouth felt wrong when it moved. Their jaw ached in a way that made forming words feel unnecessary. They were lifted carefully, guided onto a stretcher. The ceiling lights passed overhead in slow sequence as they were moved, each panel identical to the last. The station looked different from this angle. Smaller, emptier, as if it had already returned to its normal state. Outside, red and blue lights washed over the pavement, over the pumps, over the glass walls. The road was no longer empty. Police cars blocked both directions. An ambulance idled nearby, engine humming steadily. Someone explained what would happen next. They would be taken in. They would be checked. Statements would be taken when possible. Cameras would be reviewed. It was said plainly, without emphasis, as if this was one of many similar nights unfolding elsewhere. In the ambulance, the worker became aware of pain in pieces, a swelling near the eye, a sharp ache along the ribs, a stiffness in the elbow that made movement unpleasant. The medic spoke aloud as they worked, naming each observation as if reading from a list. Possible fracture, visible swelling, no obvious internal bleeding. There was no reaction expected, no reassurance offered beyond efficiency. The language stayed neutral, almost distant. It described the body as something separate, something to be assessed and stabilized. Fear didn't return. Instead, there was a heavy stillness, a sense that something had ended without explanation. The worker stared at the ceiling of the ambulance as it began to move, listening to the steady beeping of a monitor, trying to place the event into a shape that made sense. At the hospital, the process continued. Lights, curtains, gloved hands. A doctor recited injuries with professional clarity, but listing them as facts rather than consequences. No one asked why it happened. No one speculated. The focus stayed on what could be seen, measured, confirmed. When the police arrived to ask questions, their tone didn't change. They asked about height, clothing, direction of exit, how long the interaction lasted, whether anything was said. The worker searched their memory and came up empty. There were no words to repeat, no threats to quote, no explanation to give. As the night edged toward morning, shock settled in fully, replacing any lingering sense of danger. The body was safe now. The station was secured. The man was gone. And yet nothing felt resolved. The answers everyone seemed to expect simply did not exist. The next part of the night arrived quietly, delivered in pieces, never all at once. It began with a phone call. The worker was half asleep when an officer spoke their name, careful with his tone, as if volume alone might cause damage. He explained that the cameras had been reviewed. The footage was clear. Too clear. Every angle showed exactly what had happened inside the station, right up to the moment the man walked out. But that was not why he was calling. There was something else. When the officers searched the area nearby, they found the man less than half an hour later, several blocks away. He was walking, not running, not hiding, just moving through a quiet residential street as if the night belonged to him. He did not resist. What stopped the officers was not his behavior, but his appearance. He was covered in blood, not a smear, not a streak, enough that it soaked into his clothes, his hands, the front of his jacket, the legs of his pants. With too much to have come from the station alone. At first, no one questioned it. The assumption was automatic. The worker had been injured. There had been visible bleeding. It made sense. Evidence often fits neatly when you do not look too closely. But protocol demanded confirmation. The blood was collected, bagged, labeled, sent away. Just another step in making the case solid. Days later, the officer called again. This time, his voice was different. The results had come back. The blood on the man's clothes did not belong to the worker. That was stated plainly, as if it were a minor correction, a clerical adjustment. When the worker asked the obvious question, there was a pause. It wasn't the man's blood either. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. The officer continued speaking, but the words landed slowly, each one creating more distance instead of clarity. The amount of blood present did not match the injuries sustained at the station, not in volume, not in distribution. There was no explanation that aligned cleanly with the timeline, which meant the man had arrived already marked by something else, something that happened before he stepped into the lighted glass box of the gas station. Somewhere close enough that the blood was still fresh, somewhere close enough that whatever occurred had not delayed him at all. The police retraced his path, checked reports, searched for incidents that fit the window, assaults, accidents, calls that might have gone unanswered. They found nothing that explained it. No matching injuries, no missing persons, no reports filed that night. The worker listened as this was explained, and sitting in a hospital room that smelled faintly of disinfectant, staring at a wall that suddenly felt too close. The officer avoided speculation. He did not suggest possibilities. He only stated facts. There was blood. It belonged to someone else. That person had not been identified. The man was charged for what he did at the station. That part was straightforward. The footage supported it. The injuries confirmed it. There was no ambiguity there. The rest of the night remained unaccounted for. When the call ended, the worker stayed still for a long time, replaying the moment the man had appeared out of nowhere, already calm, already finished with whatever had come before. The thought settled slowly, without drama. The violence at the station had not been the beginning of his night. It had simply been the part caught on camera. So what followed was not an interrogation in the way people imagine one. There were no dramatic confrontations, no moments where the truth almost surfaced. The process unfolded slowly, behind closed doors, through paperwork and database searches and conversations the worker was never meant to hear in full. The authorities kept checking, local records first, then neighboring jurisdictions, reports filed within hours of the attack, calls logged and dismissed, medical admissions that didn't quite line up. Names were run through systems that stretched back years, nothing connected. No incident matched the amount of blood found. No timeline accounted for where it could have come from. Each search ended the same way. No match, no report, no missing person tied to that night. The man was questioned more than once. At first, he answered basic things. His name, where he claimed to be earlier in the evening, vague movements, streets without landmarks, time frames that blurred together. When the questions turned to the blood, the answers stopped. He did not deny it. He did not explain it. He simply sat there. Officers described it later in careful language. He showed no confusion, no agitation. He did not ask what they were implying. He did not ask about the person the blood might belong to. When pressed, he stared ahead and said nothing, as if the question itself did not require a response. Eventually, the questions slowed. There was only so much they could ask without evidence pointing somewhere new, without a body, without a report, without a second crime scene to stand in and measure. The case moved forward on what could be proven: the assault at the station. And the footage, the injuries, the rest was quietly set aside. No announcement was made. No public statement addressed it. In official terms, it became an unresolved detail. Something noted, then filed, then left where it was. The worker learned this in fragments over time. A comment from an officer who spoke a little too freely. A sentence that ended before it was meant to. A look exchanged between people who had reached the edge of what they could know. The implication was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. Someone else had been hurt that night. Possibly badly. Possibly worse. Somewhere close enough that the man arrived at the station already marked by it, already finished, already calm. And whoever that person was, they never came forward. No one reported them missing. No one identified them. No one connected them to the man who walked into the station and out again without a word. The worker found themselves returning to one detail again and again. The man had not looked rushed. He had not looked shaken. He had behaved like someone who had already crossed a line long before the first blow landed under the fluorescent lights. Recovery did not arrive all at once. The injuries healed the way injuries usually do. Swelling went down. Bruises faded through unfamiliar colors before disappearing. Movement returned in stages, cautious at first, then more confident. Doctors were satisfied. Friends and family spoke about being grateful, about how things could have been worse. But something else had shifted, quietly, without asking permission. The worker noticed it in small ways at first, standing closer to exits without meaning to, tracking reflections in glass instead of looking straight ahead, listening for sounds that used to blend into the background. The body began doing these things on its own long before the mind caught up. Gas stations became difficult. Not just the one where it happened, but all of them. The lights felt harsher. The open spaces felt exposed. The silence no longer felt neutral. Even during the day, even with other people around, the same awareness settled in. Who was behind the counter? Who had entered? How long the doors had been closed? Other places followed. Restrooms at night, parking lots, convenience stores with long aisles and limited sight lines. Anywhere that depended on routine and assumption now carried weight. The worker found themselves pausing at thresholds, listening before stepping inside, scanning faces automatically. New rules formed without discussion. Never stand with your back fully turned. Never assume you heard the door. Never trust quiet to mean empty. They were not rules born of panic. They were practical, calm, easy to justify. The kind of adjustments that feel reasonable when you have learned how quickly things can change. Sleep became lighter. Dreams did not replay the violence exactly. They replayed the moments before it, standing alone, looking up, realizing someone was already there. Waking up came with the same question each time, unanswered and persistent. What else had happened that night? Fear no longer announced itself. It didn't rush in or spike the heart. It settled instead, low and steady, like background noise that never fully turned off. It didn't interfere with daily life in obvious ways. It simply stayed. The worker learned how to live around it. They returned to routines, found new work, passed by gas stations without stopping. Life moved forward because it always does, but the sense of safety that once came from familiarity never quite returned. Every ordinary place now carried the quiet reminder that violence does not need build-up, and that some nights leave marks no one can trace back to their source. There was no moment where it settled into something understandable. The case concluded the way cases sometimes do, by narrowing itself down to the smallest version that could be proven. Charges were filed, dates were set, language became precise and limited. Everything outside the frame of what could be demonstrated was left behind. The man was punished for what happened inside the station, nothing else. No additional charges followed. And no second investigation produced results. No name was attached to the blood that covered him. Whatever happened before he walked under those lights remained separate, unreachable, as if it belonged to a different night entirely. The worker was told this gently, in passing, as if it were an administrative detail rather than the center of the story. There was an expectation, unspoken but present, that this should be enough, that survival should count as closure. It did not. There was no justice for the person no one could identify, no explanation for how violence could leave such clear evidence and still disappear completely. No comfort in knowing that the worst part of the night may not have been the part anyone witnessed. Over time, the event stopped being something people asked about. Conversations moved on. The station reopened, but new workers took shifts under the same lights. The road outside continued to empty and fill as it always had. Life continued without resolution. What remained was the knowledge that some acts leave no record, and some nights never fully end. That a person can walk into a place already carrying the weight of something unspeakable, commit another act of violence without hesitation, and leave behind only questions that have nowhere to go. The worker survived. That was the only clear outcome. And even that came with a cost that did not fade, a permanent awareness that safety is often just a story we tell ourselves until it stops being true.